photosynthesis. So I see people talking about using CO2, using light, maybe giving off oxygen. So this is sort of the basic overview picture from your textbook of the process. So in photosynthesis, we're going to be using carbon dioxide and water. And we're going to be taking those in, and then through a series of chemical reactions in the plant cell, we're going to produce our sugars and then give off oxygen. So we can represent that via the equation that I have down on the bottom of the screen here, where we're going to start with 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. We're going to use light, and that's going to give us 1 molecule of glucose, and 6 molecules of oxygen. And so just like we did last week with our respiration talk, I'm going to leave this equation up on the corner of the board here, and as we go through the lecture, we're going to try to figure out where each of these things are used. All right, so our objectives for today's lesson are these. And so these are kind of big picture ideas that you should be able to say something about after going through the lesson. So they are being able to answer why is it that plants are green, be able to talk about the major steps of photosynthesis, be able to kind of at a pretty high level compare 3 different types of photosynthesis, which are C3, C4, and CAM photosynthesis, and we'll explain what those terms actually mean later on in the lesson. And then lastly, be able to compare and contrast photosynthesis and respiration. So you may have noticed that the equation for photosynthesis is basically the reverse of that for respiration. But there's actually a number of similarities in how they actually function at the cellular level. So you should be able to talk about that. All right, so I think we'll get started by talking about where photosynthesis actually takes place in the cell. So does anyone know the name of the organelle where photosynthesis occurs? Yeah, good. So it's the chloroplast. So if you remember from last time, respiration takes place in the mitochondria, and photosynthesis is going to take place in the chloroplast. And just like with respiration, the different reactions that make up photosynthesis are going to occur in different parts of the chloroplast. So it's important that you understand its structure. So let's draw that out here. So this will be our cell. So outer line here is our cell membrane. And then within the cell, we've got a chloroplast. And so the chloroplast has 2 membranes that surround it, an outer and an inner membrane. And then within the chloroplast, we have another membrane structure, which we call the thylakoid membrane. So this actually kind of looks like stacks of pancakes when you see it represented in a textbook or in microscope pictures. I am not that good of an artist, so we'll represent it like that. So that's going to be our thylakoid membrane. All right, and so the space that is in between the outer and inner membranes of chloroplast here and the thylakoid membrane is called the stroma. And one last component to know about, and that is the space that is inside our thylakoid membrane, and that's going to be called the lumen. All right, so as we're going through the different reactions of photosynthesis, I'm going to try to plot those reactions onto our diagram of the chloroplast. And it'll be important to keep in mind where the different reactions are occurring. So this is a pretty complex structure. And so it's kind of interesting to think about how it might have evolved. It's actually a pretty interesting process. The name for that process is called endosymbiosis. So I think you're all probably familiar with the word symbiosis. You've heard about symbiotic relationships between organisms. And so this is an endosymbiosis, or symbiosis within. So this is actually the process by which both mitochondria and chloroplasts evolved. And so the mitochondria actually evolved first. This took place somewhere around 2 billion years ago. So at that time, just about everything was living in the ocean. They were single-celled organisms. So these early progenitors of eukaryotes, which are the sort of higher order organisms that don't include the bacteria and archaea. So these cells, they're fairly simple. So they had the plasma membrane that you've seen before. They had the nucleus, which is the compartment that contains most of the cell's genetic material. We'll be talking a lot about that during Unit 3. But the cell didn't have a mitochondria, which we normally think of as being sort of a standard part of eukaryotic cells. So these cells were actually predatory, so they got their nutrition by going around and eating bacteria. So they did this through a process called phagocytosis, which is where they go up to a bacteria and surround it with a membrane, and then bring it inside of themselves, and then break it down. So this is what happened. So there was a bacteria called a proteobacteria. And one of these early eukaryotic cells came up to this proteobacteria, it went ahead and engulfed it, and there'll be an extra membrane around it, left over from the engulfing event. And then instead of digesting it, for some reason the bacteria wasn't destroyed, but rather was retained as an endosymbiont living within that cell. And then over many, many generations following that, this proteobacterial symbiont eventually became what we now know as a mitochondria.